So it's, first of all, just nice to see some familiar faces. I'm excited to talk with you all tonight. I will say that this is a really nice opportunity for me in the sense that it's kind of the first time I'm able to stitch all of these ideas together in a hopefully coherent presentation. So I look forward to your feedback and your questions throughout and also at the end. So I wanted to start by telling you a story. So in 2016, my colleagues and I facilitated a week-long camp event outside of Fairbanks, Alaska, that was focused on engaging Alaska Native community members in in-depth dialogue about climate change. The camp wove together Indigenous knowledge, local observations, and Western climate science, with the goal of creating a cohort of people who would go back to their communities with an increased capacity to engage others in learning about and responding to climate change. One of our activities explored the terminology of climate science. So we were reviewing terms such as anthropogenic, greenhouse gas emissions, and uncertainty. That evening, while we were doing our daily debrief, one of the participants raised his hand to ask if he could read aloud an article that he saw in the local newspaper. And the article happened to be one that was by Chris Mooney, who writes for the Washington Post about climate and energy. And it was detailing how we had surpassed 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And why that was a troubling milestone for climate scientists. So when he finished reading the article, the participant explained that thanks to the terminology activity that he had participated in earlier in the day, he was able to understand the information that was presented in the article and what it meant for him and his community. This moment really remains a touchstone for me when I'm thinking about the work that I'm doing and why I'm doing it, because it serves as a reminder that yes, we can create the space for diverse or marginalized voices to join the climate conversation, but we also need to make sure that people have the capacity to effectively participate in the first place. So I will return to this a little bit later on. But before I go any further, I just wanted to introduce myself. I am Jessica Brunacini, and I help coastal communities think about and plan for sea level rise. I am the Margaret Davidson Graduate Fellow at the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve and also a Ph.D. candidate at Michigan State University. I am joining you today from my home in Portland, Maine. And I would like to talk to you about the idea that broadening participation in planning and decision-making can help to build climate resilience in coastal communities. And before I dig into that, I did just very quickly want to tell you about the Margaret Davidson Graduate Research Fellowship, which is a newly established 2-year program through NOAA's Office of Coastal Management. The program pairs a graduate student with one of 29 national estuarine research reserves around the country to address a coastal management priority through a collaborative science project. My project with the Wells Reserve is focused on learning more about the challenges of developing adaptation strategies and relocation policies, including the types of methods that we can use to engage communities in dialogues that build resilience. And I did just want to put a plug in for the fellowship to say that the next cohort starts in August of 2022. So the application period has now opened. Proposals are due in December. So if anyone is interested in the program or knows someone that might be, please feel free to follow up with me. It's been a really great opportunity for me. So what is resilience? It's definitely become a buzzword. And I think it's important to stop and talk about what we mean when we use buzzwords. As I was putting the slideshow together, I was, just doing a simple Google image search for things like resilience or participation. And when you type in the word resilience, you just get a slew of different kind of graphs or matrices or random signs like this, which doesn't really tell you anything about what resilience is or how we get to it. So I'm going to request some audience participation here and ask, what does this word mean to you all? How would you describe it? What comes to mind when you think about it? What does resilience look like to you? So I'll open the floor for input. And feel free to just come off mute.
The sustainability.
Okay. Sustainability of anything in particular?
Well, I always think of environment first. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Adapt to change.
Adapting to change. Okay. What else?
Jessica, there's a few in the chat box.
Oh,
I don't know if you can see them.
I don't think I can see the chat while
Okay.
I'm presenting.
So Karen said able to shift and change.
Okay.
Annie said bounce back through good planning.
Okay.
And Linda said ability to withstand changing climate, storms, floods, etc., without losing the ability to feed, house, clothe ourselves. And Karen added planning for a variety of things, not just having a narrow focus.
Interesting. Great. Yeah, these are all really nice descriptions and kind of mental models of how we think about resilience. So there are many different types of resilience. There's social resilience, there's community resilience, there's psychological resilience, environmental resilience, etc. And there are just as many definitions to describe the term as there are different types of resilience. But for the purposes of the work that I'm doing, I wanted to situate the definition that I am using, which is the capacity of a system to deal with change and to continue to develop. This means that this also means that a system has a capacity to withstand shocks and disturbances, such as in a recent example would be a global pandemic and or a financial crisis. It can also mean the capacity to use such events to actually catalyze renewal and innovation. So I think Annie said something about bouncing back from change or from disturbances. And I know that there are some folks who think about resilience now as also not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward to something better. So the second question is then, how do we build resilience? So researchers at the Stockholm Resilience Center argue that there are 7 key principles for building resilience in social ecological systems, or in systems where humans and nature are interacting. These 7 principles, which you can see here, include things like managing connectivity between systems, between people and ecosystems, fostering systems thinking, and promoting interconnected governance. As you can also see, principle 6 is broadening participation. So here again, I think that we're dealing with a buzzword or a buzz phrase potentially when we think about broadening participation or just participation in general. And I think that that deserves some unpacking. So again, I'm going to ask you all, what do we mean when we say participation? And particularly if we're thinking about it in the context of making decisions about how to prepare for and respond to the impacts of climate change, what do you think participation means? What does it entail? Have you participated? What did that look like? So I'll open the floor up again.
Jessica, I think it certainly means hearing, as you showed on the previous slide, hearing diverse voices and hearing multiple perspectives and exposing your plans or path forward to people who disagree.
Interesting. Okay. So bringing together different voices and maybe even sometimes conflicting voices.
That's a good way to put it.
Yet being able to continue to work together.
Okay. Being able to continue to work together. I like it. Suzanne, is there anything in the chat?
Yes, Annie said provide your thoughts, feedback on a future plan.
Okay.
And Abby said sharing input in a meaningful way.
Great.
And Jessica, I guess I'd add like the dialogue piece that you were talking about, I think is super important, and that it's not just a straightforward, here's a single question and I want an answer just to this. It's like allowing that time and space for people who are thinking about it in different ways and allowing that to come out.
Absolutely. Yeah. These are all really great answers. And so when we say, so we have these ideas about what participation looks like, and for a lot of us, it sounds like it's kind of an ongoing, meaningful process, not just necessarily a one-off, or not just necessarily kind of a one-way street of communication. It's a conversation or a dialogue that we're having on an ongoing basis. So when we think about broadening participation, what or where or to whom are we talking about broadening it to? And I welcome any ideas on that.
I would say especially to the poor and literally now disenfranchised.
Communities at large.
Okay.
And I would say being sure that you include future generations to the degree that you can.
Okay.
Jessica, Annie wrote in the chat, anyone outside of the choir. And Abby said, anyone who is impacted by or has a stake in the process and intended outcome.
Great. These are all really great. Yeah. So it's basically, when we're thinking about broadening participation, we're really thinking about, reaching beyond, as Annie said, the choir, making sure that there is a process for people who are either disenfranchised or who don't normally have the opportunity to participate, to actually give them the opportunities to do that. So my work centers on the role and effect of public participation, in particular in planning and decision making. And while there is not a single standard definition for that, the National Research Council defines public participation as organized processes adopted by elected officials, governing agencies, or other public-private sector organizations to engage the public in environmental assessment, planning, decision-making, management, monitoring, and evaluation. And the reason that I like this definition is because it's not just about asking people to provide input on a proposed plan or a proposed policy, or to just give kind of a narrow opportunity for people to, reply to something that you're probably already going to go forward with. Instead, it suggests that we look to the public to participate from the very outset of the process of identifying issues of concern and developing an understanding of how those issues impact us, of determining what our options are for responding and deciding which strategies are best fit for them and their communities, and of making sure that the solutions that we decide to pursue are actually doing what we hoped they would do in the long run. And if they aren't, because we're evaluating them, we can make course corrections together. So, of course, participation in any aspect of planning or decision-making occurs along a spectrum, such as the one that we can see here from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. As you can see, the spectrum ranges from marginalizing the public by ignoring or completely disenfranchising them, as Linda suggested, to more manipulative forms of participation and engagement that either placate or tokenize the public, to more collaborative and participatory strategies that emphasize community voice, power, and ownership. So thinking about a really common form of participation that various levels of government use for environmental issues, the classic public comment period, we can see that this is an approach that falls into the consult category, which is on the lower, less meaningful end of the spectrum. And so while it's better than completely ignoring people, it leaves a lot of room for improvement in harnessing the full potential of participation. I like this matrix a lot because it gives us some examples of the types of participation that we might expect to see in these different categories at the bottom in the activities section. So as I was just saying, the public comment period, we can see falls into more of the consultative approach. But if we're looking more towards collaboration, we might be thinking about things like having a citizens advisory committee to help guide us through our planning processes. And if we're looking more towards the more kind of empowering approach or deferring to, we might employ different opportunities like consensus building processes or participatory budgeting. So, whoops. All right. So what does participation have to do with resilience? What is the relationship between these two? So getting back to the principles for building resilience, the authors of this report on the 7 principles suggest that broadening participation helps to manage connectivity, in that it fosters the building of relationships and trust between people and different stakeholders, which helps to strengthen community networks that can be activated when responding to change or disturbances, or when opportunities arise for development or bouncing forward. They also argue that broadening participation encourages learning, in that it adds to the process of developing knowledge about a problem. By tapping into people's lived experiences and creating opportunities for people to share their local knowledge and expertise, broadening participation can help to identify and increase understanding of certain issues that might otherwise be overlooked or ignored by people in power. So it's helping to kind of surface some of those more social dimensions or human dimensions that policymakers or planners might miss at a passing glance. And then finally, broadening participation fosters systems thinking, in that the collaborative learning that happens as part of a participatory process also facilitates the shifting of perceptions, attitudes, and perspectives as people start to see the nature and complexity of problems through the eyes and experiences of other participants. Broadening participation can also help to foster legitimization and support of resilience policies, programs, and projects, particularly if people feel that their perspectives and priorities are accurately reflected through that process of participation. It can also, if it is conducted in a way that provides people with the knowledge and the resources that they need to actually participate, so kind of getting back to what I shared at the beginning about making sure that people even understand the language that you are using in these processes. It can also increase people's capacity for civic engagement in the future, which of course is a core principle for democratic systems where citizens have the right and the responsibility to participate. Broadening participation can also support equity and justice initiatives, particularly when participation is broadened to include communities who are frequently marginalized or disenfranchised from decision-making. And in fact, questions about who decides and how are central to the concepts of procedural justice, which is a core dimension of environmental justice. So procedural justice is concerned with the processes and procedures of decision-making, including who participates and whether or how their involvement shapes policy or planning outcomes. And closely related to that is the concept of procedural equity. So this is the equity in the process of decision-making, including recognition and inclusiveness, equal representation, bargaining power, voice, and equitable access to knowledge and resources to participate. I think that we can probably all agree that addressing concerns about equity and justice is fundamental to resilience. And I think in particular, the past couple of years have really highlighted that for us. It's fundamental to resilience. And if we link it back to the principles of building resilience, it's really not just about creating space at the table for diverse and marginalized groups. It's also about having the opportunity to surface and learn from their lived experiences, their knowledge systems, their community aspirations that really allow us to better understand and identify problems and monitor the ways that we are responding to them. So none of this is to suggest that participation is a silver bullet solution. And if anybody is selling that to you, I highly advise that you don't buy it, because participatory processes can be plagued by power dynamics that, if they are left unaddressed, can further reinforce inequity and marginalization. There are also issues related to access when it comes to participatory processes or participation. And not only is it access in the sense of when and where a meeting might be held, for example, but also whether or not the language that is used in these types of meetings is even accessible or understandable to, members of the public or different stakeholder groups. And then additionally, the purpose and the process of participation matters. So in other words, who participates, how, and for what reason. If we think back to the spectrum of participation, we know that it can be done for manipulative purposes, and that, of course, undermines resilience. So I wanted to highlight, actually, I'm going to stop there and just pause for questions before I dive into the next bit.
Jessica, this is Chris. I have a question.
Okay.
So, and maybe this is what you're going to cover in the next bit, but I'm loving this very understandable summary of the literature. But then I'm wondering how we make it real, how we make the ideas real in our community. So are you going to talk about that in the future, or are we going to have to read your dissertation?
No, I don't expect anybody to read my dissertation except my committee. and even then, I would be surprised if they actually read it. Yeah, so the next bit is offering an example of a type of or an approach to participation that I think is innovative and really exciting. And then I will also share a little bit about the project that I am hoping to do, which unfortunately I don't have any results for because it's still in the planning process. But yes, I will be providing some examples. Any other questions?
Jessica, this is Linda. Will you be talking at all about the disruptors and how to deal with them in this process?
Not well. It's possible that when I talk a little bit about the project that I am going to do, or that I'm planning to do for my Davidson project, it might help provide some ideas on that. But we can talk about it afterwards as well.
Okay, thanks.
So I'll keep going and kind of dive into what Chris's suggestion is. Like, yeah, okay, this is all really nice in theory, but what does it look like in practice? So I wanted to highlight an innovative approach to public participation that I think is really exciting. I think it's innovative. I think it's likely that sometime in the US or Canada, there will be a process similar to this that will happen. And this is something that's modeled on democratic deliberation. So deliberation here focuses on how problems are defined and understood, what the range of possible solutions might be, which solution or solutions should be pursued, and who should have the responsibility for implementing them. And this process is called a citizens' assembly. So, and it's based on the deliberative approach, which uses a dialogue-based communication process that brings together citizens, subject experts, decision makers, and other key stakeholders throughout an ongoing process. Deliberative approaches are founded on a style of problem solving that centers communication with others when addressing collective issues or problems. Democratic deliberation is characterized as a process of inquiry, action, and reflection that fosters learning and perspective shifting and remains open to new information and interpretation. So a lot of these words are the same words that I was using before when I was describing what the literature is saying about why broadening participation is so great for building resilience. So this is actually a process that takes to heart those ideas and implements them. So the citizens' assembly model involves selecting a random and representative sample of citizens who participate in a process of learning, consultation, deliberation, and decision-making. The final recommendations that they come up with as a collective are fed into the official governing processes and considered by policymakers moving forward. So in addition to the sample of citizens who participate in the official process, there are also opportunities for the broader public to follow along and provide feedback, which you can see at the bottom with the arrow. That's showing those other types of opportunities that even if you're not chosen to be part of these citizens' assemblies, you can still participate and provide feedback. So France, the UK, and Scotland have all recently held deliberative processes called Citizens' Climate Assemblies, which produced official recommendations for acting on climate that are now being considered by the policymakers in each of these countries, particularly in the run-up to the next Conference of Parties meeting that's happening with the international group of folks who are dealing with climate change. So I can talk about this, but I think it might be more effective to see a very short video that I'm hoping will work that highlights some of the participant experiences in participating in the UK version of the Citizens Climate Assembly. So let's see if this will work. Can everybody hear that?
No.
Jessica, when you first selected it, did you say share computer sound?
Oh, I did not.
That's the mistake I always make
Oh.
when I'm trying to share something.
Let's see. Well, for the purposes of not taking up too much time.
Dear resident.
Dear resident. Dear resident.
You could be one of over one.
I will just put the link in the chat.
We could just hear that, Jessica.
Oh, you could hear it?
A little bit of sound just a minute ago, yeah.
Okay, let me try it again. Thanks for bearing with me. Let's see.
Dear resident.
Dear resident. Dear resident.
You could be one of over 100 people
selected to take part in the UK-wide Citizens' Assembly on how
should the UK tackle climate change. It was it's an interesting proposition.
Is that working?
I could hear the sound, but I couldn't see video.
Okay.
Right.
I'm just gonna pop it. I'm gonna pop the link into the chat, and you can all. I'll pop it in at the end, and you can all have a listen, have a look and a listen afterwards. So to pull all of this together, I feel like it would be useful for me to tell you a little bit about the project that I am working on for my Davidson Fellowship at the Wells Reserve. So remember that the goal is to learn more about the challenge of developing adaptation strategies and relocation policies, including the types of methods that can be used to engage communities in dialogues that build resilience. So the town of Wells is currently in the process of updating their comprehensive plan, which charts the town's path forward for the next 10 or so years. Built into this process is a series of community forums where residents can participate in collaboratively identifying problems that they are concerned about, as well as priorities for future development and problem-solving opportunities. So, of course, this is a coastal community, and we know that sea levels are rising all along the coast of Maine, including in Wells. The change that Wells has experienced over the last century, which is a little more than 7 inches, may not sound like much, but 1 feet of increase in sea level rise equates to a 15-fold increase in the frequency of nuisance flooding. And by the end of the century, Wells is projected to see somewhere between 2 and 4.5 feet of sea level rise. So a recent vulnerability assessment that was conducted for the Tides, Taxes, and New Tactics project that was led by the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission lets us visualize what that kind of change might look like for wells. So here we have a visual of wells. We can see which parcels of land in and around the harbor are likely to be impacted under sea level rise scenarios. The blue parcels show us where the land is likely to be inundated with water, and the red parcels show us where both the land and the buildings are likely to be touched by water. So this is the picture under 1.6 feet of sea level rise. So just keep an eye on mostly on the harbor area as the colors start to change. And here it is under 3.9 feet of sea level rise. We can start to see more of the red impact. And finally, here we have 6.1 feet of sea level rise. So we can really start to see that Wells is going to be pretty severely impacted by sea level rise, particularly under the higher scenario. The residents and the business owners in Wells are already feeling the impacts of sea level rise because they are seeing increased flooding, more coastal erosion, and bigger storm surges. As well, community members in Wells are already responding to these changes. So some are trying to find ways to live with water by choosing strategies like home elevation. Some of the communities are trying to keep water out by choosing strategies like breakwaters or seawalls. And then taking ourselves out of the context of Wells specifically, but looking to other communities who are dealing with the impacts of sea level rise, such as those in Staten Island that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy. Some people are trying to move out of water's way by choosing strategies like buyouts. So all of these options could work in Wells, but how do we know which ones are most appropriate for the town? And how could the town pursue them in a way that prevents a kind of patchwork approach where confusion and conflict are possible? In other words, how can Wells plan for the effect of sea level rise in a way that allows them to deal with change and continue to develop, or how can they plan to be resilient? So in order to test some of the ideas that I've shared with you today, some of what Chris was saying, some of these theories in the literature, I am planning to explore the linkages between participation and resilience by working with colleagues, several of whom are on the call today, to design, facilitate, and evaluate a deliberative process that would engage Wells residents in dialogues about sea level rise. So the idea is that participants will share their perspectives on and experiences with sea level rise. They'll have the chance to explore projected impacts together, such as the reports that were produced by SMPDC. And they'll have the chance to collectively assess their different options for response. So those different strategies of living with water, keeping water out, or getting out of water's way. And the goal is that the findings of this process would feed into the town's comprehensive plan update. So it would also help to inform that process. This is very much still a work in progress. It looks like the dialogue process will not happen until sometime in the probably late fall. And I would be excited to reconnect and share the results with you at a later date next year, or to have any of your thoughts or ideas or input in the planning process. But once I do have those results, I would be very excited to reconnect with you so that I might be able to further convince you that broadening participation in planning and decision-making can help build climate resilience in coastal communities. And with that, I will thank you for your attention, and please feel free to reach out, and I very much look forward to your questions and our discussion.
So thanks, Jessica. What is the schedule for the updated plan for Wells? So you're going to be under that requirement in order for that for your work to inform that plan? By when do they have to deliver that to the town council?
Yeah, so they are aiming to have the plan completed sometime around the beginning of next year. Well, actually the middle of next year. I think their goal is to have the updated plan ready for public review and input by around June of next year. And then for the updated plan to actually go to vote sometime in November. So they just recently had the first community forum that's part of their outreach and engagement process. And that was really focused mostly on introducing people to what a comprehensive plan is, what the process will look like. And they did, I have to say, they did a really nice job of inviting public participation in the sense that they started with the question of what are the changes that you have experienced in this town in the past 10 to 15 years from when the last comprehensive plan was completed. And the next, I believe the next community forum is scheduled for early November, after which I am hoping to work with colleagues and do the forum that would be specifically focused on sea level rise impacts.
Jessica, a question.
Yes.
Do you think that there's like a certain formula for working with communities? And like, and what exactly is it? Do you need to have, you know, town staff that are willing plus engaged people? Like, what do you do if you don't have engaged town staff, or if you just don't have like a group of citizens that want to take this on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good and difficult question, and one that you have seen me struggling through as I'm planning these processes. You know, we have had conversations about the kind of readiness scale of like where communities are in terms of their willingness or their readiness to even engage in these conversations. And so from my perspective, just, you know, moving here and establishing kind of an understanding of the system and starting to build relationships, honestly, I think the biggest thing that I would just have to offer is that you have to have time and patience to build relationships with people and to understand what opportunities there are for you to work through. I don't really think that there's necessarily like an equation. But I think understanding where the community is. So for example, you know, when I proposed this project to NOAA before getting to Wells, I had these big grandiose ideas of like, we're going to go through a you know, deliberative process that will bring people together for 6 different workshops. And we're definitely going to get to the point where we make decisions about how the town will respond and move forward. And then I got here and I was like, well, that's not happening. Not yet, anyway. And so, you know, I've gotten to the point where I'm thinking about what Wells is ready for. It seems like they are ready to start the conversation. And luckily in Wells, I've found, you know, willing partners, but I do think that capacity at the local level is definitely a big challenge.
I think just that will be helpful for other people to know.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe just starting the conversation is like the best place to start.
Yeah.
And then if you don't have more questions, can you tell us a little bit more about your photo voice thing? But I'll do that right now.
Yep.
I have a question, Jessica. I'm wondering, in Wells, for example, how do you find the disenfranchised people and how do you get them involved?
Yeah, so I think that is always, I think that's always a big challenge in terms of doing any type of, you know, meaningful engagement with communities who are usually not involved. So one of the ways that I think, you know, one of the things that I think you can do is to to look to different types of community leaders who might be what some people refer to as like key influentials. Like they are leaders within a certain community. It might be a religious community. It might be an, kind of an ethnic community. Looking to those people who kind of have the ear of the rest of their community and starting to build relationships with them to try and kind of, increase their interest or their capacity to participate. Maybe it's, by making sure that, for example, when you are scheduling participation, you're thinking about, for example, if this is like, let's say we're engaging with, we want to engage with like a group of fishermen or lobstermen. We need to know what their schedule is and think about when they would actually be able to participate. So thinking about things like the timing, thinking about things like the location of where people feel comfortable to gather. I started to think about this a lot. It's like, well, okay, we can talk about the linkages between participation and resilience, but how do we actually broaden participation? So some of the ideas that I had like jotted down that I think deserve some research are, obviously meeting people where they are. So go to them, don't expect them to come to you. If there are events that are being held, go to people and ask them to engage with you there instead of expecting them to come to a meeting with you. Tapping into existing networks and leveraging key influentials, really taking the time to build and maintain relationships with people who might be disenfranchised. Oh, another one that I think is really important is, if at all possible, compensating people for their time, particularly if they are contributing, their knowledge and their experiences. That's work. And people are taking their time to share that with you. So if there is a potential for you to compensate them, that is something that I know that some groups have been able to do with the democratic deliberation approaches. And then I also think allowing for multiple inputs. So thinking about, okay, well, if people can't make it to an in-person meeting, is there a survey that we can do? Is there an online workshop or a focus group that I can do with people, just to expand the different opportunities to participate?
So Jessica, there's a couple things that just come to mind that you might want to think about. And then I have some specific questions about Wells in particular. I do some mentoring, and one of the things that the mentoring group that I'm part of says is everybody who's my age, like in their 60s, should have a mentor who is in their 20s. Because there's so many things that we don't know about communication and social media and that kind of thing. So if you can maybe, so my suggestion is get a mentor who's 20 something and find out what they suggest about reaching people that you aren't reaching by your regular means. And the second thing is, Wells and most coastal towns have resident populations and visiting populations. And it's always been, so for the comprehensive plan, while it is valuable to get the perspective of people who visit here as opposed to people who live here, it is the people who pay the taxes here who are going to want to have the deciding vote, if you will, for the comprehensive plan. Do you have any experience or knowledge about how that kind of split? Because I mean, it's like 3-to-1 for the visitors versus the residents, has been handled in the past or might be handled in this situation specifically for what?
Yeah, so that's something that I have been thinking through in terms of considering, who I would target for participation, because I think that there is some real potential for not maybe conflict, but definitely differences of opinion and perspectives between not only, seasonal visitors who may not own property, but people who do own property and who are only here seasonally, versus people who are here year round. Also thinking about people who are living further inland versus people who are living on the coast. So this is something that I am still in the process of learning about in terms of how the town has dealt with those kind of divides before. I know that it is something that came up at the first community forum. That was a concern that one of the elected officials, as well as a participant, said, how are we going to get the input from people who own property here but are only here seasonally? And so, yeah, it's a good question. For me, one of the things that I'm thinking through is that multiple input opportunity. So, if the event that I'm doing is in November, then that kind of precludes the participation, the in-person, maybe, participation of seasonal folks. However, I think that there are other ways for them to provide kind of input and perspective during that process that I'm actively kind of thinking about and exploring. And it might be bringing them in virtually to participate in the conversations. It might be doing a focus group with them where that information is then presented during the in-person event, things like that.
Maybe you could set up a booth at Compton's at night to get the input from the seasonal people.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the idea of having a mentor to kind of help me think about. I actually think, I'm kind of in a weird in-between space where I feel like I don't have my finger on the pulse of older generations or younger generations. So I think it would be helpful to have both. If there aren't any other questions just at this moment, so speaking of different ways for people to have the opportunity to kind of provide their perspective or their experiences or their input. So Annie alluded to another part of the project that I'm doing, which is using the method of photo voice. So photo voice is a participatory action research methodology that invites people to help you go through a process of answering a research question through the use of photographs and descriptive stories that go along with the photographs. So I am using this method as a way to explore people's attachment to place and how that affects their the way that they think about and experience change, the way that they perceive risk, and also the way that they think about the future. In particular, I'm working with a community that is very susceptible to sea level rise because it is surrounded by water. It's marsh on one side and ocean on the other side. And they've already experienced a lot of change. So the point of the method is to, you ask people to go out and take photographs. They submit them with descriptive captions that kind of tell a story. I then have one-on-one interviews with them where we kind of dig in further to these topics and kind of explore some of their thinking about, environmental change and how we respond to it. I then go through a process of having a group discussion where they get to share their photographs with each other and their stories. They get to kind of, hear whether or not other people are experiencing the same things or thinking about the same things, and they help me kind of identify shared themes or concerns or topics. And then the ultimate goal is to have a public exhibit of these photographs and the captions. And the interesting thing here is that it kind of becomes a tool for participation and for being able to have kind of a say in decision-making processes, because the public exhibit is meant to reach policymakers and decision makers and planners. So you actually invite them to come and see the photographs as well, and the broader community to engage in a bigger conversation. I've shared a little bit about this with the Wells town manager, and she was very excited about the idea and wanted to expand it to the rest of Wells, which is a little more than I can take on. But it's great to have some type of buy-in from political leaders to say, yeah, that seems like a really interesting way for us to hear from the public about what they're concerned about and what they care about as we're thinking about planning for the future of this community.
Hey, Jessica, I have a question on that. So because it's becoming public, how do you see that playing into like when they're captioning, thinking through like what they really feel or they might want to write versus what they actually write? Like, how do you chat with them about that and try to figure that out so it's genuine and it's honest, but it works for the whole situation, for the person and for the public and for your project?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And so like part of it, I think, will be my one-on-one conversations with them and also the group dialogue that they'll have, because I think that once they start, I think that there has been a little bit of like, trepidation maybe about wanting to, not wanting to step on toes or not wanting to call too much attention to an issue that you think is important. But the interesting thing is that seeing all of the photographs together, you start to get a real sense of like, oh, it's not just me. Actually, it's all of these other people that have identified this as a problem. So I have some additional context from my one-on-one conversations with them, and I expect the group discussion will help to provide more context, which I think will help in actually choosing which photographs are kind of most representative and kind of speak the most to these shared stories or themes or concerns.
Jessica, where will the photos be on exhibit? At the reserve or somewhere else in Wells?
I think at the reserve. I talked with Nick about this and he seemed pretty excited to potentially have like a photo exhibit there where we could make an event out of it and invite folks to come and see it.
If you want to tap into more people that are excited about doing such a thing, definitely check out the Facebook group Wells Now and Then. Because those are people who have already pulled out their photos and and already are talking about them, and you might be able to see some. It's a subgroup, certainly. It's not completely representative, but it might be a place that you could start in terms of maybe beginning to have people identify themes and I can tell you already that picture you have of Webb Hannett Drive, that house on the blue house on the end is gonzo, and they've replaced it with one of the many McMansions that's elevated above them.
Yes, I live there.
Both sides of oh. So Tonya, you are well familiar. You and the yellow house across the street from Eldridge.
I'm about 4 houses away from there. I've been here 41 years, so I've seen a lot of changes here.
Yeah, so that for me has been one of the really powerful things about the Photo Voice project is, the folks that I'm working with have these very long-term connections to this place. And it's, some of it is seasonal, some of it is year-round. But they've been coming to these places for generations now. And the amount of change that they have experienced and seen with their own eyes, I think is really important and gives context to, sea level rise for policymakers or for council folks who might be kind of wary of the science. But if they hear it from their own citizens, say like, look at what we have seen, like, look at this change, we're really worried about it. That for me, I think is the really kind of powerful potential of this project.
Are you aware also? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Suzanne.
Sorry, Linda. I was just going to let you know there's a question in the chat and I see it is going on 7. So maybe this will be our last question, but do you see it in the chat or you want me to?
Yes, I do. I see it. And thank you, Abby. That is a really great question. So my experience, my background is in environmental education. And so I really came to this from more of an educational background. And when I first started, you know, the thing was that I was thinking like, oh, we need to, you know, educate people and get them up to speed and make sure that they know the latest about the science before we can move forward. And I think that to a certain extent, there absolutely is space and there's a need to do education with folks, you know, thinking about like what are the projections for sea level rise, you know, in terms of both how much we're going to see, when we're going to see it, how rapidly you know, it will change. I think what matters more is education is part of it. I think it kind of matters more where it comes in the process. So in my experience, starting with people's lived experience is the most important because it makes people, it gives people the opportunity to share their experiences and their knowledge, but it also makes them feel heard. And it gives you an opportunity to build on what they're sharing with you. It's also really nice in my experience when we've started that way with like, tell me about how you've seen, you know, your community change in the past 10 years or whatever. When you can then kind of come in and weave the science and the statistics and the models and everything into that conversation, it then kind of provides an opportunity to make people feel validated in a certain sense, because they're like, oh, so the things that I've seen and that I've experienced are actually, you know, that's what science is also showing is happening. Like, that's really interesting. So I think education is a big part of it. I think it's more thinking about where that educational kind of component comes through. But it's really, I would just say that participation for me is synonymous with learning from each other.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and for everybody for joining tonight. Jessica's email is on the Wells Reserve's website under the staff profiles. She's on there. So you can reach her that way if you have further questions or an idea for her.
Yeah, and for those of you who are living in Wells, I would love to stay in touch, because if you have an interest in participating in the projects that I'm doing, it would be great to have you.
Yeah, I'd love to do it.
Great.